Okay, it looks like we are running. Let us get our opening show on the road here. Hello, Evolution Hour, 23rd of March, 2026, in our exciting, way too exciting year of doom. And TortuganWordPress.com still out there in internet land with all those old cute papers. See if I can get my screen back here. There we go. Okay, we are, as you know, on Titans, and this is the concluding episode of the Titans series. We are through this monstrosity. There actually is one further chapter in it, but it's no references. It's just a summation of the crap that's previous. So the couple of sources that we're giving you, this installment finishes it off. We're still at the above 71% level on misrepresenting sources. It's heavily weighted towards CMI apologetics, blah, 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 that we've dealt with altogether. And then, of course, this is another Luskin week. So we'll be giving you 3 more sources on that little puppy, and as well as giving an indication of what we will be doing next week, which will be the beginning of Duane Gish, venerable, ancient, old print media Duane Gish, Evolution, the Fossils Say No from 1978, and then the 1995 revision, Evolution, the Fossils Still Say No. These are both books that have technical citations sprinkled in them directly in footnotes in the 78 book, and then or at the back of chapters in the 78 book, and then actually as footnotes in the bottom of the page for the 95 one. But no total bibliography. So right off the bat, you can't tell really how much is in there. So as an interesting historical exercise, it'll be a walk down memory lane. There will be relatively few technical citations along the way, so there won't be too many links on that, although I may be doing some follow-ups on particular topics. But we'll be tracking through each of the books because in pretty much the same superstructure expanded out. The 95 book is much longer. But how much of the 78 book is cited in the 95 book, and what's cut out, if anything? And as well as catching up to speed, because although there's 17 years from the 78 book to the 95 revision, the 95 book is 31 years old. It's old enough to have graduated from college. So that will be an interesting context. I can tell you from my own research that I've been doing on the TIP project decades ago now, that the thing that struck me about the dinosaur section in the 95 book was how superficial it was. And I think the dinosaur elements of the first book are even worse. But we'll be getting into that rather nicely. That was one, there were huge swaths of taxa material that's just missing completely. Also, I've been finding some little delicious meringue for the whale chapter for Rocks Volume 2. The whale section of the chapter, courtesy of our good old not friend John Woodmarap, because it turns out he had done papers in 2002 and 2003 trying the same trick he did with his mammal piece from 2001, which is scavenging through Euclidistic papers and trying to show there were reversals, which no, they aren't, and not giving any of the particular details. So he was basically up to his old tricks, which was the whole topic of the reptile-mammal transition analysis in Evolution Slam Dunk. And here he was trying the same shtick with the whales. Another, hopefully, scoop will be when we get down in that section to Jonathan Wells, because his last major book, Freebie, there was a chapter on whales in it, and that turned out to be publicly available. So even though I didn't buy a stupid book, I do have the whale chapter, and that's 2017. So that will be an interesting element to see we will be tracing creationist reactions to the ongoing paleontology in whales in the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and so forth. And of course, the increasing amount of developmental biology and genetics material. It's just absolutely delicious stuff, of which very little of it penetrates through the apologetic sphere. There's also little snippets of things happening over in the intelligent design movement that will be in that chapter, which I think will be rather fun, including the thing that never happened, which was the paper Gunther Beckley was going to be doing on whale evolution that he was promising Gutsick Gibbon back in, I think, 2019. It never materialized. And since Beckley has gone to whatever award he has gone to, that one apparently is never going to occur any more than von Sternberg doing his detailed breakdown of why he thinks whale evolution is wrong. All they can do is stuff on the internet, lectures and talks, not technical papers, even though still they have their little biocomplexity journal. So anyway, that gets kind of up to speed about what's going on. I also won't be able to put up my thank you for our patrons this time, because Word, for some reason, is not activating. What I think I'm going to have to do is generate a PDF of the material from my Word on my home PC and then export it down so that I can bring that up, because I think PDFs will still open okay on this. And that way we can bypass that glitch that's been occurring now and then with Word life. This is the vicissitudes of life. Anyway, so where exactly are Sarfati and Tay running in their final bit? They're going about some stuff about velociraptors and trying to skirt their way around dromaeosaurids and some issues, and they're doing by some of the same idiotic tricks that we can see elsewhere. They are aware of a paper from 2007 they clearly didn't like. A couple of papers, in fact, from Turner et al. From 2007, one of which is on the quill knobs in velociraptors, and it's the only paper on quill knobs in velociraptors. And in that classic creationist shell game, they don't really call attention to the fact that there aren't a hell of a lot of fossils to deal with. So indicate that this is somehow presentation, but in fact, I've seen no indication in the regular paleontological literature that anybody disputes the paper. And although creating the paper, including this Sarfati out at CMI, the fact that nobody in the regular paleontological is arguing, including people who were more skeptical of the dinosaur-bird connection, because they can always fall back on the idea they're just flightless birds. It suggests that this is not quite what it's chalked up to be, a creationist argument. I'll be putting in a link to a 2021 paper by Lee et al. On, and part of that's the same team that we're working on the Turner paper, on a newer example of a newer on this. And they're also indicating that Velociraptor are a dozen, and they're often very fragmentary fossils. Now the other Turner paper about a very specific topic, and it's the suggestion of trying to work out, was the smallness of birds a derived feature, or was this kind of a feature of dromaeosaurids that is being carried over into birds and has been somewhat disguised by the fact that a lot of dromaeosaurids can get quite big. And so they were talking about an example from quite late in the game in the dromaeosaurid lineage, 75 million years ago, that is one of the smallest of the dinosaurs so far found. And so they were arguing that dromaeosaurs very probably, especially if you track back very early, they were probably quite small. And so therefore the smallness of a lot of birds is not a novelty. Now, Sarfati and shell game, because they're trying to argue that the paper by Turner was offering it as, quote, a bird ancestor, unquote. And so then going all no cousins by objecting that it's, quote, younger than both rigid feathered dinosaurs, unquote. But of course, at no point had the paper been asserting that it was a direct bird ancestor. And in fact, their 2011 follow-up paper also was making no such claim, as it's quite painfully obvious from their analysis that clearly putting dromaeosaurids off on a side from which birds eventually are developed, but not directly from this particular early basal taxon. And also the whole no cousins notion that a lineage isn't supposed to be able to persist down to some point where it's contemporary with other forms, just as all your cousins dropped dead when you were born, or all your cousins dropped dead even before you were born. They can't have any descendants living down to your time. This is a ridiculous argument. It's as stupid as the why are there still monkeys argument. Sarfati and Tay's book is ending on a really pretty shallow note with this kind of desperation element. They even have one final hand wave, which is bringing up an odd allosaurid, or rather quote mining Darren Naish on this odd allosaurid that has this kind of little spike sticking up on its back, to try to end run and cast doubt upon the interpretations that might come from various skeletal materials. Needless to say, they never bothered to cite any of the papers on the actual taxa. And so I'm throwing in Ortega from 2010 on this bizarre humped carcharodontosaurid theropod that is intriguing animal, but it's not going away the whole issue about whether dinosaurs and birds are related and how closely. So next week, then, this will switch over to where we'll actually have Duane Gish being the target of our analysis, and we can see all the stuff. Therefore, it'll be a big jump in some respects chronologically back to material that's trawling back to the 1950s and beyond, some of which may be available. And so if some of these older books and things turn out to be accessible online, I'll be putting links up to them just so that you can follow up along in the bingo card approach, or learn whatever you want about the ancient times of paleontology back in the mid-20th century. So that leaves us down to our latest installment in the Stupid Luskin Show. And they are fairly getting pretty boring and repetitive. And so I apologize for being boring and repetitive myself, because here we are, some 170 some odd sources into their listing, and none of them have buttressed their main contention, which is that a big, over 50% chunk of retrotransposons and pseudogenes and the like are functional. None of these papers have buttressed that. The one that we discussed in the very first episode is kind of, because of vague wording, might be spun in that direction. And the fact that this big long swing in the next few weeks are going to be doing exactly the same element in these papers from like 2016, that's a decade ago. And they're effectively just reinforcing the material that we've already discussed at length about how ALUs form connections inside of genomes. They're just starting to work that out back in the 2016 period. And yet, boop, there they are on the list. So we've got a paper from Boutier on how ALUs connect up to a reaction mechanism on tuberculosis infection. Hello, Vesta. I'm not listing the Boutier paper as an example of theodicy, however, because this is not a case of it facilitating tuberculosis. It's actually part of the defensive mechanism, because it causes things that can slow down an infection to come into play. So ALUs are acting as a handy little trigger because they're so bloody reactive. They connect up so easily in the genome. So is it a surprise? And it isn't a surprise, given all the papers that we've looked through so far, that the genome systems have worked out how to exploit that connectivity element of ALU, but not always with complete pleasantries, as we're about to get to. So anyway, the Boutier paper summed up what was going on, and I thought it was rather nice. So I'll be putting it into the main text of the description. ALU repeats serve as platforms for binding of RAR and LXR nuclear receptors, whose signaling greatly reduces mycobacterial burden, at least partly through altering macrophage lipid metabolism. These results provide compelling evidence that expansion of repetitive element genome has contributed on a large scale to the evolution of transcriptional responses to pathophysiological signals. In other words, that a thing that is doing a thing a lot, no matter what, can have some potential triggering effects that can be exploited positively, and therefore there is a selection pressure for those things to be sustained in the system. Duh. Not anything supporting the notion that they were designed to be there, because then you would have to account for all of them, not just the little niche that we're dealing with. And by the way, there was nothing in this paper that was indicating how many of the ALUs are involved in this thing. So that primary element of like 50%, 90%, somewhere up in the high percentages that Luskin and others, Fazal Rana, have kind of hinted at for ALUs and retrotransposons, those numbers are not being reached, objectively so. So far, we're continuing to reinforce the fact that on this issue, Dan Stern Cardinale and Zach Hancock and their field, they're much better on the data field than you're going to find among anti-evolutionists, particularly the gang at the Discovery Institute. So the two other papers, one of them, again, interesting paper by Gu on transposon elements that show how these things connect up. And then the final paper, Ranjandiran et al. 2016, that one slams into the theodicy problem because it's explicitly talking about a gene, the MAIE1 gene, that is affected by ALU methylation. And the name of the gene is spelled out quite explicitly in the abstract of the paper, which is the migration and invasion enhancer 1 gene. Did the ID bunch putting this on this list not bother to read the abstract? So this would be an example of a thing where diseases are being enhanced and facilitated, the gene that's doing the bad thing, by these ALU methylation elements. Is that designed? Does Casey Luskin want to express an opinion on that? Does Douglas Axe? Does Ann Gager? Does anybody else floating around in there? Or over in creationism land, does John Sanford or Nathaniel Jensen or Jeffrey Tompkins, or farther down the apologetic food chain, Standing for Truth, Donnie Budinsky, or any of these other people feel like weighing in on this point? By all means, please do so. And try to explain in a rigorous way whether you think any of these things are designed. It sure looks like a kludgy mechanistic dynamic that is picking up on things that are in the system that they can't prevent from being in there. They can't get ejected, but they can be pseudogenized or buffered in such a way that they can be doing no problems. Heard about Spinosaurus mirabilis, been called hell heron. Well, the Spinosaurids are a fascinating group. They've got these great big finback sort of things. They apparently have, as if memory serves me, the sort of teeth that are characteristic of piscivorous animals. So they're thinking that this is kind of like a giant dinosaur bear that's tromping into streams and picking up fish, hunting in that route. Exactly the dynamics of the sail part, how much of it is thermoregulatory, how much of it is sexual selection. It is interesting that a bunch of dinosaur groups have developed independently that kind of sail fin element. There's an Ouranosaurus that's like that. And then, of course, you got the Spinosaurids on the theropod side. You found isolated instances of this on the reptile mammal side with the famous Dimetrodon. And it is a genuinely open question as to just what the dynamics is why those things have the kind of features that they do. Whether it's a brand new example, I think there was an example of a newer Spinosaurid, but I have not seen technical literature in that on that particular taxon, so I won't venture an opinion on all of that. But the hell heron, yes. Well, the Spinosaurids, they were pretty good sized critters. Serves me, and I got a model of them in my dinosaur downstairs. They're certainly easily the size of an Allosaurid, and so this is not a trivial little critter. It would dwarf anything like a Kodiak bear knocking around. But with extinct animals in this is always fascinating and frustrating because we don't have the living ecological system to look at, and we don't have their actual genomes to look at. So we can't tell a lot about some of the internal structural relationships and lineage elements to see what kind of forms might be evolving from one lineage-wise. The best they can do is based on the physical bones, then they can deal with the elements from that direction. But I'm sure if we can get in the Wayback Machine, that we would certainly be able to tell a heck of a lot more about what's going on with them. And they'd be quite intriguing little creatures. Well, big creatures. So anyway, yeah, Spinosaurus, I think they came up like very in the Tay book, and procedure in most creationist context is to simply call their family a kind. But the degree to which they are linking up with other theropod groups evolutionarily is a matter that the creationist systematics doesn't permit. They have to keep things pretty much at that family level because they can't allow the taxa to, Barrowmans to spill over too much, because that increases the number of things on the ark and they just don't have the room. As we will be dealing with in Rocks with Air Volume 2, that whole ark encounter thing, it can be fairly said that the ark encounter has drawn a line in the sand that I don't think it's going to be possible for creationists to avoid tripping over, because they've reduced the number of kinds to the bare minimum via the family level, even although there are cases of things they've left out. There's a almost extinct group of rodents of which there's one living member, but the extinct forms were some of the biggest rodents ever. They were like a ton, that got harumphed at in a kind of gee whiz way by creationists. But when I checked over with the Ark Encounter list, aren't in the Ark Encounter list of Barrowmans. They should have been on board. So there are various examples of how not comprehensive they have been in keeping track of all of that. But the Spinosaurids, if memory serves me, is treated as a separate kind, as its own little Barrowman in there. Now, whether they're quite large animals, so the usual trick that the creationists are dealing with is that they're little teeny babies. So they're just little juvenile. You can see the cute little, kind of like a little baby alligator, how cute those little things can be. Maybe it'll be clucking like an alligator might, and it'll have its little tail, a neotenous tail going up there with the little ridge on the back. But other than that, what is the Ark? Is a magic zoo boat. Well, if you post in magic, which to some extent they kind of have to do, although I heartily recommend the late great Strike's tour through the Ark Encounter back many years ago. It was not long before his tragic death. I was involved with doing some audio commentary on the bit, but he and a friend went through and were looking at the various exhibits and things. So we got nice looks at the little charts and stuff that were on the samples that they were showing, and that proved to be absolutely delicious as to what they were bringing out and what they were leaving out, including the fact that they were including evolutionary ancestors for some of these forms. Dinohippus and the giraffe and all of that stuff. And then, of course, their equivocation on pachycetids and the relationship of whales. Very funky. But they've got all stuff, the Ark Encounter. I mean, you got to give them chutzpah. They've done this elaborate arrangement of, they have like a foundry on board and like remarkably elegant accommodations for the family. Needless to say, if they wanted to go smell-o-vision route, you could have a wonderful stench of all of the critters involved and all their little dung and poop that's being generated. But I think they don't think. Yes, that Pimp That Ark, I think, is one of the titles in there. And so if you aren't familiar with Strike's channel, it's still available on YouTube. Those various playlists. You can get to it from that direction. They were droll and quite effective. And so the problem with any model like the creationist model where they don't have the facts is that if they try to get too detailed, like putting in their little moon pool and working out the kinds of misplaced concreteness details aboard, it can get really quite hilarious. And the extent to which they've got to um, tweak the data to maneuver around it is quite clear when you look at it quite closely. For me, the most relevant variable was the fact that this is the lowest number of kinds aboard the Ark of any analysis, way below Woodmarap's 1990s book. He was still thinking in terms of like 20,000 kinds aboard, which clearly the people laying out that super tanker design with just the small number of decks, working out the logistics, realized that they couldn't possibly have that many on board. And they're even stretching it in having to go for small critters and all of that, and leaving out parts. And obviously no indication that they want to have insects aboard, and they're leaving all the plants pretty much outside. Do they deal with some of the crops that really can't survive in a watery environment? Again, misplaced concreteness, because they would be leaving out a lot of these taxa so they don't have to worry about it, let alone the issue of marine forms that don't necessarily live in freshwater environments, and what is the salinity level of the water during the flood, and what happens when they're just smooshed down once the water disappears. What was the layout of the pre-flood world? Where was the land masses? What animals were living there? What animals then were coming off the Ark? Where that is, the mountains of Ararat. But then, is there any logical evidence to suggest how things could have differentiated and get to the places that they are? How the hell did the kids of Noah manage to make it all the way to the Americas? And how fast did that happen? All of those details, if you start trying to work out the physical evidence, it just falls apart. And that's why you don't find them trying to make those kinds of things. That there'll be tunnel visiony around the Mesopotamian area, but the far away you get culturally and historically, the less likely to hear about it. The Chinese would be popping up only as a circumstance of maybe a Chinese flood legend that can pop up in their literature. But the whole masses of cultures going on in China and how far back those things go in the archaeological record, all of which has to be crammed into a post-flood environment. No. That's it. It's they're in as big a problem there as the Mormons trying to explain pre-Columbian America in consistent with the Book of Mormon. It ain't going to happen, kids. So we're trying to get a lot of this information coordinated in such a way that you can see the scale of the problem, both for just the archaeology and material of the Middle East, but also with the other cultures involved. Let's not forget the Australasian area, as well as the Americas and Asia. When we get into the little fiddly bits of human evolution, then we're going to be talking about Africa and the African dispersions, first in the Homo erectus and then eventually in Homo sapiens, plus the diversification into Neanderthals and also the funky Denisovans. There's more and more information coming along online every time there. They've been very slow on the uptake on this kind of stuff. I'm sorting out in addition to working on the whale section, and then we'll be getting to the Grand Canyon and the geology stuff, the Paleo World's material, finishing up that element. I'm also doing the big sort for the massive material that I had accumulated for human evolution, of which not all of it's going to end up in the new book because it's a lot of stuff. Practically on average, technical papers that are prior to 2010, 2015 will probably be alluded to only from antiquarian interest, because the big upshot of stuff is much more recent material, because you have so much more archaeology, you have so much more genetic material, you have DNA directly from the Neanderthals, which blows to smithereens the idea that they're the same species. And then you've got the outliers out there that are the reason to believe crowd that, yes, they accept that they're not the same species as humans, but then they go overboard in the opposite direction by arguing that they are not, air quotes, soulish. And this involves a pretty tendentious degree of hair splitting that's purely theological. So in that respect, Fazal Rana and Uras and all that have as big a weird blind spots and rationalization on hominids as Ken Ham would on trying to work out the baromons and who Behemoth and Leviathan were in the Old Testament chronicles. So one bad method to rule them all, even though they have slightly different foci going on. Okay, so at this point, I would have been sticking up a cute little blurb on our patrons, but as I said, Word was just having a problem opening up here, so we will skip directly to bring up our rocks for their advert. Our share screen. Doop. There we go. Boop. And that should be sharing. And have you encountered creationism? And I do attest to the fact that Rocks Were There Volume 1 is gemmed, packed with sources, and Rocks 2 is even heavier. I suspect I will have to make the font size for the reference even smaller than in the initial volume to get it all in. But because there's just been such an enormous amount of technical literature, and it's really important to get that material available so that people can see the context of it and to much as possible compared to the fluppery that goes on in the creationist literature. So anyhow, that puts us up to speed on that end. Peter, for a couple of months, wondering, Peter's doing just whiz bang. He's continuing to do hosting with Jackson on their show. I think he still does the material for R and RAR and various people. So yes, he's a little busy beaver. And hopefully Peter will be doing an advert for Rocks Were There Volume 2 once we get that concluded. We'll see whether or not we can also get some nice interviews going with some of the original cast, like Apologia and others, to and maybe some stuff on Dan's channel and Erica and all that to discuss all of the contents of the new book, because it's bumping into all of their areas with a vengeance. And the human evolution stuff. Remember, on the core issue that's been the obsession for anti-evolutionists all along is us. It's all about us, which is kind of the chapter title we're going to be having in the new book. Even if creationists like Duane Gish and others will be venturing into a lot of other evolution issues, they were forced into it because of the trajectory of evolutionary thinking. If you were a creationist in 1880, there was way little. You had the smattering of Neanderthals, which were being conceptualized as maybe cavemen and or deformed Napoleon soldiers or something. But other than that, there seemed to be a big hole in the physical evidence. And then that got filled in by the screwball fraudulent Piltdown, where they were obsessed with the idea of big brains first. And so they were creating, Dawson was creating that particular taxa. But things really started to change after World War I. Robert Broom, who was switching from finding fabulous reptile mammal stuff down in the Karoo, is starting to find material on the early Australopithecines. And then the leakies come into the picture and so forth. And after you get past World War II, where you're now getting better dating techniques, radiometric datings, there's more paleoanthropologists in the field, they're finding more taxon. You had the brief, chronologically, from my perspective, brief, although it lasted for a ridiculously long time in the literature in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and really kind of fizzled out when the newer amount of data resolved the issue. But there was the big debate between how early humans were. And so some of the complaints about Australopithecines were from people who had an ideological obsession about having Homo sapiens date back way, the origins of Homo date back much earlier, and they wanted something other than an Australopithecine to be involved. But a lot of that has just become moot with the systematics and the newer fossils. And also a thing that was starting to come in with Johansen and others in the 70s and 80s, the realization that you had multiple hominid species living simultaneously, that the African landscape had way more contenders going on than what we were thinking about in the simple something or other leads to Homo erectus and then us and everything else disappears. Now it's much more intricate. And in some respects, the old debate that was going on between the multi-regionalists of Walpoff, who's still around, and the strict out of Africa modes with these pulses of African migrations, both of them were right and both of them were wrong, in that there was a lot of gene flow going on. It has nothing to do with the origins of human races, which is how some of this debate got into discussions of racism issues. No, human races and skin colors and all of that are very recent and are taking place after all of our competitors have disappeared. And we've even stopped doing interbreeding with hominid Neanderthals and Denisovans by that time. So it's the fine tuning of the genetic analysis is much more sophisticated. And so we're making a hope that we'll be picking up on all the little tropes and things that get brought out. Everything from the trope that apes don't have white eyes like ours, the sclera issue, out to the little diagnostic trope. We want to make it clear that you can use it as a diagnostic if a creationist brings up Nebraska man and Piltdown, especially in the context of almost within the same sentence, then that person's a young earth creationist. It's just not a connective trope that pops up in the intelligent design movement. And so these little diagnostic elements, just like somebody can be a superficial anti-evolutionist, but if they start going on about radiometric dating and complaining about the Big Bang, excusez-moi, those are young earth creationists. So whenever you're dealing with, say, an anti-evolutionist, or whenever you're dealing with a theist, you need to pin down where they are on the landscape and knowing what questions to ask and what issues to bring up. If you need a shorthand with somebody that's just sounding like a religious apologist, ask them when the Exodus took place. And if they answer, well, about 1450 BC, then bingo, that's a traditionalist, and they're very probably going to be a young earth creationist. Whereas somebody that's aware of the actual historical scholarship and the trend of the last 50 years of archaeology is going to have to say more like 1200, 1150, 1250, if at all, BCE, and they will probably say BCE, right? And that would put them into a different ballpark. You do find a certain number of the gang at the Discovery Institute and that clearly kind of want traditional elements, but they tend to avoid doing chronology. It's their creationism light for a reason. And so they're often very, very vague about pinning a lot of these little fiddly bits down. But ask the questions and find out where they are to try to pin them down on these issues, to calibrate where they are on stuff. But traditionalists and anti-evolutionists are definitely traditionalists. They really don't want to give up on that standard Usher-style chronology. That even if they're willing to have a long earth thing, a lot of when it gets down to biblical times, they really want to follow that traditionalist framework. And the Biblical Archaeology Review and others that are conservatives in this area are still pushing for that 1450 BC thing. This would also pop up if you're over on the weird fringe, that the Velikovsky types and all of that. And I used to be a Velikovskyan, so I know this inside information. They were also going for that traditionalist dating in that respect. So chronology, litmus tests are handy tiny little bits. It's as gross an issue as if someone were unclear as to when the Civil War took place. And so if you have a camp that says, no, it's 1861 to 1865, and another camp says, no, 500 years ago, then clearly you've got a big issue going on here. And asking that question and getting them onto the field will do so. So always try to get litmus test questions. In a political realm, if I bump into a Trumpista, I would want to be asking them about where Trump gets his money from. The average creationist doesn't know diddly. Trumpista doesn't know diddly about that. It's partly real estate development, business fraud stuff, and then he becomes a public figure, branded name. Even to this day, my understanding is the vast majority of buildings with Trump's name on them, he doesn't own them. There's stuff that he just licensed his name out to, and he gets a cut of their money, independent of whether they make any money. Yeah, the Exodus never happened as outlined in the Bible, a study of Egyptian history. Yeah, it's been so difficult. In fact, Canaan, this is kind of read outwards, and Joshua Bowen and others have done all sorts of neat little stuff on it over the years. That the Exodus as the linchpin of then the conquest of the Finkelstein crowd and all the archaeology, that massive influx of hundreds of thousands of Hebrews that just take over the real estate, that isn't supported. A lot of this end up in the written version of the Bible are wish fulfillment and folklore and bits that may or may not have happened to actual Hebrews, or they may have been in with people they bumped into and they've threaded layers of things together. It's very difficult as a historian to figure out what the hell the original tales were and how much of it was going on. Can we rule out that individual families of Hebrews didn't have some ancestors that had bad experiences hundreds of years earlier in Egypt, because there was a lot of what you would kind of think of as Hebrew braceros, I think is how Tom Lehrer referred to it in one of his songs. There was stuff, as a historian, it wouldn't surprise me that there was things going on with these various cultures, that some of them would be the direct ancestors of Hebrews, some of them would be lore that's popping up in tribes they're associating with, in whatever that's going on out in the wilderness, if there was a wilderness, that because it's occurring in a non-historical framework where you don't have documented evidence. And a lot of the cultures involved were pre-literate at this time. And it's not until much later that they're writing tales down and codifying them. Oh boy, that's the telephone game on steroids. So at best, you can argue that the Exodus tale is not taking place as advertised. And we can be reasonably confident that the sort of depiction that you see in the Ten Commandments, the big VistaVision epic stereophonic sound of Cecil B. DeMille that they trot out every Easter, that didn't happen. But what exactly did happen, in what context that led to the stories that end up in the Bible, that's a big open question. So anyway, hi, Brian. Yeah, that's and all of this stuff has direct connections up into the creationist environment, because creationists tend to be very traditionalist in their viewpoints. They require rearranging more history than just mangling the origins of Israel, as we make a great pains about noting in Rock's Volume 2. It's the fact that they've got to move Egypt. Egypt is the big stumbling block in their framework. They're okay with stuff when you get down to more historic elements. By the time you get down to the New Kingdom in Amarna, although even there, the fact that the Exodus accounts is referring to Pi-Ramesses, which is a New Kingdom place, and is clearly anchoring it in that New Kingdom environment, not the Middle or Old Kingdom context that gets dragged in if you're trying to ram it back into 1450. Various people have tried to come at the Exodus issue via plagues. You got all these spectacular things with the frogs and the rain of blood and, river turning red and the death of the firstborn. And then, of course, you've got the escape and the parting of the Red Sea and all of that, the nice big CinemaScope events. And there's been a cottage industry over the years to try to find physical explanations for these things. Tantalizing ones pop up in a lot of different contexts. That if it weren't for the chronology part, the Santorini eruption produces tidal waves, and there's all sorts of things. But the problem is the chronology's too early. That this stuff is taking place, hundreds of years before even the traditionalist Exodus date. So there's very possibility that little bits and pieces of tales and lores have gotten folded and modified over time that eventually get landed in the accounts that get put into the book of Exodus. But because we don't have primary sources to work with, we don't have manuscripts and paper trail to see how the tale moves through one iteration than another. It's very different than somebody. I was just putting a note in the new book about an analysis that was done at the Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith about Harry Rimmer and his role in blithering on about Jonah and the whale and the apologetics of that. Some of these issues, the Jonah and the whale story is a thing that would have preoccupied creationists of 100 years ago way more than it does now. It's not that it doesn't get mentioned at all, but it's not a top ticket item. And it's almost a footnote in our book because we're discussing whales on a much bigger scale than whether or not they can act as temporary habitats for people swallowed by them. So that's another matter. Exodus stories come during the time of the Babylonian. Yes, so much of that does. One of the things we really stress in the new book is the degree to which the Babylonian exile solidified lots of attitudes about things. And some of the tales that they're codifying in the tales that eventually end up as the written Bible are coming from the Babylonian myth constructions, Enuma Elish and all of that, as well as little fragments and bits and pieces that are coming from Egyptian culture, because Egyptian culture had a lot of influence on a lot of people knocking around in the area. And that elements of the stories that end up in the Old Testament may have reflected actual things that may have happened to actual people in some context or another, not necessarily in the time frames being depicted or not necessarily with the actual people being depicted. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But because the paper trail is so bad, and this is all being swum along from people who are trying to codify stories that were probably not written tradition and then became written tradition, try to make sense out of that. And so the kinds of murkiness that you inevitably get into, as will be called attention to by Joshua Bowen and various others, as a historian, I'm going, duh. The examples that I can use that are much less controversial that illustrate what's going on here, because I'm fascinated by the origin of games. So I'm aware of how chess developed. I'm aware of how card games developed. I'm aware of how the tarot originated as a card game. I eventually plan to do a tarot universal deck that will allow people to play these various tarot games without having to have all the specialized decks, because a lot of them are really neat. Tarot is one of the great games of the planet, and it's only known from the city of Bologna because you have to play it with one of these cockamamie Bolognese Tarot decks, which are very odd and specialized, and they're not easy to get. Yes, it's easier for a whale with a small throat to swallow a man than to swallow the average Bible story. Yes, that's yes, it's well, and even that famous tale, about it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. That apparently another instance of a translation mistake. That kamalos, the spelling of the word in Greek versus like Aramaic or whatever, that the difference between camel and the word for a hawser rope that you use in rigging and in sailing are almost the same words. And so it's probably originally, it's easier to put a big thick rope through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go through heaven. It had nothing whatsoever to do with camels. And I think there was a parody bit in the old National Lampoon that I remember from years ago where they were talking about a rich man who a fictitious rich man who commissions a stained glass window showing a camel going through an eye of a needle because he wanted to be able to get into heaven, and he wanted to eliminate that awkward problem in there. The old National Lampoons back in the 60s and 70s, they were vicious indeed, and I have fond memories of a lot of the stuff. Robert McCall did some just hilarious things. Some of the stuff, I think Gahan Wilson did a lot of hilarious bits for the National Lampoon. That were high rollicking times. In the good old innocent days when all we had to worry about was Tricky Dick Nixon and the Soviet Union and the possibility of nuclear Armageddon. So, well, simpler times. So anyway, that'll get some material up to speed. A lot of these religious issues will presumably be discussed in a future project that Jackson has suggested that we do, which is a book on the evolution and origin of religion. And that one, I strongly suspect, will be a 3-volume thing. Because we would not want to just restrict it to the God of Abraham clause. We would be wanting to discuss the broader issues and the cultural ramifications of religions in all the various contexts and things. And there's enough technical literature and stuff on cognitive science and the cultural attributes of things where you can surmise a lot of the roots of religion going on, even though we don't have written records of this stuff, that can give you the big picture elements that I think to some extent Daniel Dennett had a lot of good points to make about the idea that early religions are coming about transactionally, that they're trying to harness the dire forces around them, so okay, rain is a problem, who's the rain god and what can we do to get on its good side, and all of that. And eventually then higher level cognitive approaches are buffing up the religions and eliminating levels of godliness and consolidating them in a relatively smaller number of gods to avoid the clutter, although we can see the Hindu culture still manages to get by with a gazillion little gods and still have local practices where they can retain all of that. And it's probably no coincidence that Hinduism is one of the older religion groups that probably crystallized and developed and has retained its cultural heritage. Christianity, I should say the Judeo-Christian Islamic blob, is much more recent and has operated in a lot of its origination cultures amongst literate cultures, and so it's got a different dynamics than you find with, say, Hinduism. So anyway, yes, so long, Mom, a song for World War III. Yeah. Everybody that is not aware of Tom Lehrer, who just died this year, I think, or maybe it was last year, but anyway, quite recently. Anyone who does not know about Tom Lehrer and his hilarious material, his stuff is available on CD. Some of the stuff is probably available on YouTube. Some of the shows and stuff that he did. Get on it, because he was one of the great national world treasures of clever, socially sophisticated, intellectually exciting humor and social commentary all at the same time. There was an old show that was on for like a season or two. That was The Week That Was, which was sort of a precursor of The Daily Show and other political humor programs. And he wrote some of the songs for that. I don't think he performed on any of them. Suddenly some stupid little notation popping up on my screen here. I had to get rid of that. But yeah, Tom Lehrer is just extraordinary, and everybody who is unaware of that person needs to be developed, as well as Spike Jones and a lot of other great musical heritages. The Hoffnung concerts, for anybody who loves classical music and serious music and also hilarious parody. And Martin Mull, he was terribly droll. My gosh, some of the stuff that he was doing back in the 70s later became known more as an actor on a lot of sitcoms and that, and also died quite recently. There's a lot of stuff. Margie the Midget song that's a parody of Randy Newman, and some of the little droll routines he would be doing that would be skewering a lot of. That was the running theme of all of these different humor people is there nothing sacred? And the answer is no, there is nothing sacred. we can make fun of anything, and we understand it and get a better sense of it precisely by making fun of it, as well as getting some laughs, because that's the only way you can get through the world and life. So anyway, that kind of gets us up to speed on that. We are actually out with mainly an hour of show. Well, there we go. That's what happens when we get sidetracked on stuff. So we'll be continuing to keep you mindful of all the things. As I said, next week we will be launching a newer structure, looking at some old and new. It's hard to think of Duane Gish 1995 as new, but and also as it will be relevant for people who are younger, because so much of this stuff it's print and it's not available online, and therefore there is a whole increasingly invisible tradition of creationism that is the print-based material that older creationists will be sucking off of with a vengeance, but that the newer brigade, I suspect that wouldn't surprise me if Standing for Truth and some of these other younger people have never bothered to read any of these older works. They would never have had any opportunity to look at them. In some respects, they might find them too crusty and boring. Oh, they got footnotes. Yeah. Well, that's the way it is. Bricklayer's accident report details a series of mishaps, a barrel of bricks, a pulley, and the bricklayer's own weight. Okay. So anyway, everybody stay safe. And if you're in spots with icky weather and or icky ice stopo people running amok, or the problems that we have contingent upon the God King Emperor doing his stupid war in Iran, I mean, this is just blundering right and left and not having any plans for stuff. All bets are off, kids. And keep your powder dry. Make sure you're not worried about debt loading issues and the like. And let's muddle through the next few years and see if we can't pull off a normal, free, and fair 2026 midterm election without the Trumpistas trying to pull the rug out from under them with their idiot rulings. I can tell you, nobody's going to tell us in Washington State that we can't use mail-in voting, because that's all we do here. And I bet Utah is going to be in exactly the same boat, because they do mail-in voting exclusively. So anyway, everybody stay safe. Watch out for the wooden penguins, especially the ones armed with lasers. And we will see you all next week with the beginning of our Duane Gish analysis. Au revoir.